So when we're looking at our feet, just like this, our center line is the line that occupies our rear heel to our lead toe. Our knees should be bent and faced over our knees, or excuse me, over our toes, regardless of what direction our toes are. So if you prefer a more open stance, like a fencer's stance, your knees should still generally be in the same disposition or orientation as your toes. If you like a more closed stance, which is normally what I take, I'm usually kind of 50-50, or I'll go back and forth between the two, then same thing, your knees should generally follow the same orientation of your toes. So while we're standing like this, I want you to look down, keep your hands down by your sides, and look down at your rear foot, whether it's your right or your left. All right, while you're looking at it, I want you to put your weight on the backs of the balls of your feet and lift your heels up slightly off the ground, which I know is your distinct weakness.
Yes.
But if you can, try to get your heels light enough that you'd be able to slide a piece of paper underneath them, right? I'm not gonna make you fight like this, which is how I actually prefer, but just light enough so that you can slide a piece of paper under there. That's about where you want your feet to be. And you should feel heavy in the feet, which means your weight is sitting comfortably in your feet, but on the back of the ball of your foot. I don't want you to be on the ball of your foot where your weight's leaning forward. I want you to be in the middle of your foot as well as you can approximate that while still allowing your heels to be light enough off the ground. That sounds complicated, doesn't it? Right? It is a little bit complicated, but this is how you stay heavy but light on your feet. Does that make sense? Right? All right, so we're here. Now, with that consideration, I want you to pivot your back foot, just like that. All right, I can see that everybody's pivoting. Back foot, right foot. June. There you go, good. Just like that. You know, in longsword fighting, you'll hear people talk about how you grip the sword, and they'll say firm but gentle. Yeah. Same thing. We're going for light but heavy. All right. So you got that turn there, right? You got that pivot. This pivot is the foundation of throwing your right hand.
Or your left.
Right?
Or your
left. Or your left. Excuse me, yes, for our dear southpaw over here. All right, so one of the things you might notice is your foot might slide when you're doing it, especially if you sink your weight into it. Ideally, your hip will be right over your knee. And if you get that, when you bend that knee, your hip's actually going to be behind the knee at that point and directly over the toe. Usually when that happens, it'll stop the sliding problem, but not always, depending on whatever the surface is that you're standing on. So just be aware that if sometimes you're throwing a punch and that foot slides out a little bit on you, just put it back. You finish the punch, put it back into position. Yeah, say like that never happens to me anymore, so when I do that, it throws me wildly off balance. All right, you gotta turn that heel. Everything is dependent on that heel turn. Everything. Every bit of the rest of that punch. All right, you guys ready to go over the punch motion now? All right, fix yourselves on your center lines. We're about to go. All right, so everything moves contingent upon the movement of the rear foot. The rear foot turns. As the heel comes out, it turns your knee in. You see that? Right? So the step-by-step process of how this works is it goes foot, knee, hip, shoulder, elbow, fist. So what does that mean? That means everything that happens up here is a reaction to what happens down here. Does that make sense? All right, so when I throw my right hand, I want you to note the other thing, my elbow stays tucked away here. When I turn the back foot, it drives my knee in. The knee turning in pulls my hip. My hip pulls my shoulder forward. My shoulder pulls my elbow forward. And my elbow pulls my fist forward. And if you look, you see how straight my fist is? What kind of punch is this?
Hook.
Straight.
Oh, this one.
One.
Yeah, that's jab.
This is a straight punch, which is a 2. Straight punch. So, my back foot turns. My knee comes in. My hip comes forward. My shoulder comes forward. My shoulder pulls my elbow forward. And my elbow pulls my fist forward. And it moves completely straight forward. Just like that. You see that? That's why it's called a straight. There we go. See how straight that is?
Yep.
So at the very end of the punch, you get to the last 9/10 of full extension. This is where you're going to turn the fist over. Now, it feels like you're turning the fist over from your wrist. You are in fact turning the wrist over from your forearm. But if you think about that, people have a tendency to elevate the elbow outwards, which is what you do when you throw a cross, but not when you throw a straight. So while you're thinking about this straight punch, you're gonna turn from the wrist while keeping your elbow down. And because everything is happening as a reaction to the movement of your body, you're going to put as much body weight into that punch as possible. Does that make sense? Now, the key factor here is we're teaching this right now as if you're throwing the punch standing still. Everything is a reaction. If you're moving forward, changes a little bit. Typically what happens is people will throw what's called a walk-in 2. Bring a slight step forward, and then they'll throw it. But notice how my foot still turns. So, what you'll also see, and a thing that Willie's been working on a lot, and if you ever take one of the classes he teaches, when he shows you the 2, he's showing you this really closely tucked inside 2. You call it an inside 2 because you keep it right here, and you typically throw it at shorter range. And if you look, it doesn't look a whole lot different than a normal 2, except the fist is either here, and you keep it closed inside the shoulder, or you put it directly in front of the shoulder. You're gonna get more length out of this punch and more power, but you're way more likely to land this one when you're in close proximity. And because you're keeping it on the inside, right by your center line, what it does is it gives you the ability to throw the shot very quickly on the move. So,
I know exactly here that he's talking to.
yep, yeah. And so I usually just kind of go back and forth between the 2 because I like practicing both. So that's it right there. The foot turns, the knee turns, the hip turns, the shoulder turns, the elbow turns, the fist turns. Everything happens as a reaction. Does that make sense? Good. Now, what does the weight do?
Goes forward.
No. Absolutely 100% absolutely not.
Makes you fat.
When you throw the 2, the weight drops straight down. It drops straight down on the right foot. Now, you can't always sink your weight. Again, this is throwing the punch, standing still in optimum, ideologically vacuous conditions, right? Like, there's absolutely no other external consideration. This is just you practicing the perfect punch. When you're moving or you're hitting a person, or even if you're hitting a bag, situations change. But in general, you want to drop your weight straight down. The only time your weight comes forward is if you're stepping forward. And again, we talked about this. And that's because you don't get as solid of a drop in the weight. But there's so many instances when moving forward on your 2 is required by the combat context then it's good to practice that, which is why I won't tell you to not practice that. But what I will tell you not to do is to allow your weight to cross your center line. Because if you look, what happens to my chin? My chin moves about, I don't know, what is that, 6 inches from here to here? You see that?
Yeah.
What am I doing? I'm exposing my chin to enemy fire. That's me being as dumb as possible. Are there certain times when that's okay? Sure. If you're throwing across and you're coming in across somebody's center line, particularly, and you're bringing your weight from your rear to your lead side because you're going to follow up with a hook, absolutely okay for you to do that. But in normal circumstances, when you're just throwing a straight, if your weight, or your face rather, comes forward, or both, like this, all you're doing is endangering your teeth. And that is dumb, right? And you're gonna see people that try to tell you, oh, this is how you throw straight. They don't know what they're talking about. They've been trained poorly and they're training others poorly. So don't fall into that trap. So what we do is we turn and we drop straight down because it still allows the weight to come forward through the fist without recklessly endangering your chin. If you need to see that in demonstration, I can show you just by observing laterally, right? So my chin's right here, right? Yeah, you can move if you want to. You see where my chin is?
Yeah.
Watch how little my chin moves forward when I throw the punch correctly,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
All right, now watch what happens when I shift my weight to the other foot.
Oh, wow. Yeah, jeez.
See the difference? All right, the other reason, or the other consideration, when we throw the back foot, you'll hear people, it's not necessary to turn the back foot. All right, so let's just pretend that we're dumb and we're gonna throw the straight from our hip. You see this range right here? All right, this is as far as I can go. Maybe I can squeak out a little bit more. Watch what happens to my range when I turn my back foot.
Oh, wow.
Significant. Another 4 to 6 inches. So most of the time when you see fighters incapable of landing their straight, it's because they are insufficiently turning their back foot. Because guys with good range but poor fundamental punch mechanics will still be unable to land the two. So, some of the things we covered in that span of time. The cost of shifting your weight from your rear foot to your lead foot is not outweighed by the benefit in power that you perceive. Secondly, you don't want your shoulders to deflect. You don't want your spine to curve either way. Now, some fighters prefer to be a little bit more crouched over. I'm okay with that, but if you look, my shoulder only changes elevation to come up and protect my chin. What you'll see is like some fighters like to hike up the back shoulder in general here. Typically you're out of range, and if you're protecting your chin, defensively you can come in to guard against a hook, but I don't think that hiking up your back shoulder like this is a very good idea. But what you don't want to happen is this, and that's what we were talking about, right? Your shoulders have to maintain their relative elevation to each other. When the weight comes down at the end of the punch. And because of your weight dropping, you have to change the elevation of your punch. You aim a little bit higher to compensate for that. Does all of that make general sense? All right, so we worked on the 1-1-2 on top of that. Everybody grab some water, and then we're gonna go into the next little piece here. Functions of the jab. Fundamental considerations, or not the jab, for the straight. We got some fundamental considerations here. I called them functions, but these are actually fundamental considerations. Functions are here in the manual. All right, so things I want you to think about in the fundamental considerations. It's the fastest power punch. It requires the least setup. So that's why you always see 1-2 or 1-1-2. You should see 1-1-2 a whole lot more, but people throw bad double jabs that don't work, and that's why you don't see it as much. It's a straight path of delivery, which means you see the target, you're throwing the punch, and it's there. It's kind of Not only does it require the least setup, it's also just the easiest to aim. Because wherever your jab lands, so too will land your straight so long as you're throwing it correctly. The longest range power punch. I can hit you from farthest away. It's the sniper rifle of the power punches. It's the easiest power punch to redirect, which is kind of like, especially if you're sinking at the end and you know you're gonna have to elevate that punch, you could do that in the middle of throwing it. Because it comes out straight, if you're throwing it correctly, there's no guess as to where it's gonna go, so long as you're maintaining positive control of it. Lastly, is thrown from the same position as the jab. I'm just right here, I don't have to change anything. Jab comes out, even before I finish bringing the jab back, I can already launch that straight. Does all of that make sense? Kind of obvious? All right, important distinctions. The straight and the cross. All right, so now we're gonna talk about the cross, which is a variation on the jab, or on the straight. See, I keep calling them straights jabs now because everybody got me all flustered thinking about schedule. All right, so what's the primary distinction between the straight and the cross? Who knows? What do you do differently in the punch?
Elbow up. Thumb
Very good. All right, so when you throw the straight, elbow stays in and down. When you throw the, and if you watch me throw it on the center line, you'll see my two knuckles here, your first two metacarpals, wind up directly over the center line. That's why it's so easy to aim. When you throw the cross, it comes out a little bit differently. Now, if you can see, it still winds up in generally the same place, but the trajectory to getting there is different. You see that? Here, point A, point B. Point A, kind of like point B, point C. Make sense? That little curve at the end is extremely useful for getting around what? Elbows. Elbows, fists, whatever people have in the way right here. Ah, all right. So when you're trying to figure out whether you should throw a straight or a cross, it's relative foot position between you and your opponent. If I'm standing here and my opponent is standing here on the same center line, actually, let me borrow you, John. Actually, no, you're a damn bloody southpaw. You used to fight
I could try.
orthodox.
ambidextrous.
Yeah, let me borrow you.
I could go right.
Yeah, go right-handed just for a second. Right
See if I
there.
can remember. There we go.
There you go. All right, now reorient yourself onto that center line. There you go. All right, so when I throw the straight, I throw it from this position. If you look down at our feet, they're almost parallel. Does that make sense? Like to each other, right? The line of his heels, the line of my heels. This is a great position to throw a straight because it's going to come in between his elbows. If I want to throw a cross, I don't want to throw a cross here because watch what happens. Almost invariably. And it's because of that slight hooking action. However, if our feet are not parallel, if there's asymmetry in our feet, now all of a sudden I have a path to get past the glove. And I can either force him to move to his right, opening this angle, or I can move to my right, opening the angle to be able to throw the cross.
So I move over.
Yep, if you do that, right, bang.
Gotcha.
So, all right, you can go back over there. So, the cross can be a very powerful punch. And earlier when I was talking about whether you keep your weight back or you send your weight forward, this is a good instance of sometimes when you bring it forward, depending on what I'm doing. If I'm trying to keep my distance and I'm throwing a cross because he moves or I pivot and I throw that cross, if I'm maintaining my distance because I plan on either evacuating, egressing, doing whatever, going on the defensive, I'm going to keep my weight back. And I'm going to throw it basically like a straight, but in a different foot position with my elbow out. If, however, I'm using the cross, particularly against somebody that stands in a very ablative stance, like a sideways stance, like guys that fight like this or like this, you see these guys too, good opportunity because his hands are already going to be in a position that facilitates a cross to throw the cross while moving across his center line. Then you're going to bring your weight forward. You can even shift your weight forward to here because you're moving off of his center line, and you can use that to set up your lead hook. Does that make sense? A lot of times you'll see that too. You'll see bang, the overhand or the cross, and you come forward, throw the lead hook. Does that make sense? All right. So the 4 is a hook. The cross is between a straight and a hook. And the straight is kind of on the other end there. Does that make sense? It's just all punches are you striking an opponent with your elbow, but your fist gets in the way. When I throw a hook, right, I'm hitting him with my front 2 metacarpals, my thumbs up. I'm really hitting him with this. This stuff just gets in the way, right? Because I want to have a rigid bone structure. When you throw a hook this way, same thing. Thumb up, 2 metacarpals. I don't want to do this because if I hit somebody in the dome here, what's going to happen to those last 2 metacarpals? They're going to get smashed, right? So I throw it here. It's the same principle. When you're throwing the cross, that elbow changes the delivery angle, comes around the opponent's arm, and you get them somewhere from here to here on the mandible, ideally. Right?
And that's the difference between that and the hook, where the hook is higher.
The overhand. The overhand, the elbow breaks the plane of the shoulder. So, cross, overhand. Now, when you throw the overhand correctly, it loops around like this. Against a taller opponent, you're going to lose range, but you're more likely to get that shot. The straight, the cross, and the overhand are all in the same family. Straight, cross, overhand, or overhand, right? Same kind of thing, just more extreme motions. A hook comes around like this, and you change elevation based off of the target. That being said, an uppercut could arguably be a hook. A hook can arguably be an uppercut. And you change very little in the mechanics. You squat, turn, lift on an uppercut. You squat, turn, and shift on a hook. Right? Small distinction, important one, but still kind of a small distinction. Punches are all related to each other. The same fundamental mechanics, the same like ways of generating power. There's still only 3. You shift foot to foot, you change elevation, your weight moves up and down, or you rotate. Those are the 3 ways you generate power. Shift, lift, turn. Between all the punches. Does that make sense? All right, so now we're going to work on making that distinction. We're going to throw 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. Just like that.
1, 2. So what's the variation of those twos? Is straight?
Straight, elbow stays down. Cross, elbow comes out. Overhand, elbow comes up. Typically with an overhand, you're going to be moving forward, and so you can loop the arm more to get higher elevation to come around. If you want to come down on the, somewhere over here on the corner of the orbital, but. So we talked about fundamental considerations. Fastest power punch. It's got a straight path of delivery. It's got the longest range of all the power punches. It's the easiest power punch to redirect, and it's thrown from the same position as the jab. Now we're actually going to go over the functions of the straight. So, this is from my boxing manual that I wrote. All right, power punch, right? It's power punch. Obviously, it's not a jab. Turn your foot, put your whole body into the shot. It's a closer, which means that you close range, right? And that's that walk into that we talked about, right? It's an inside counter. So what does that mean? So you counter from the same side typically. There's a couple times when you can opposite counter, but countering on the opposite side is dangerous. So if somebody throws a hook on this side of my body, they throw their left hook, I want to roll in and counter same side. As you see that, it's an inside counter. His hook comes in, I'm here with very little effort. Now I can continue the punch as soon as I've cut off his hook, right? I've brought my shoulder forward and protected my chin. And now what I've done is I've decreased the distance that he can effectively use the hook. As soon as I get into that position, I'm gonna counter with that 2 and then probably a 3 afterwards while I continue moving in the direction of the punch that he just discharged. Inside counter means anything that he throws on the outside, I can throw something on the inside because the inside will invariably be exposed wherever he's throwing that punch from. Make sense?
Yep.
All right. It's like if somebody, there's this old, this is kind of old school, this old means of stopping somebody from throwing their right hand, especially if they have a tendency to just throw crosses. Somebody throws an exposed cross like this, you just step in and you just hit them in the bicep. It's called a stop. And literally you just, like with a jab, where you can open your palm like this and just stop them. And then as soon as you go bang, then you throw a better mechanically straight so he can't do it to you. It's the other reason you don't see it very much anymore. People don't really teach a stop anymore. But when you're here and you throw your 2 like this, it's impossible to use a stop. Stop only really works against the cross or somebody that finds no distinction between throwing a straight and a cross. Does that make sense? All right. So it's an inside counter. It's also a space maker. So the same thing. Just like you could use the 2 to close range, you can also throw your 2 from here, and if somebody's coming in too close, you can use it as a warning shot, or you can just stuff it in their mouth, because you can throw it from here to here. You don't need much space when you throw it correctly to be able to push your opponent back, right? And you can even see that if you try pushing somebody. If somebody gets too close to you and you push them like this, you will direct a lot of force straight into the center of their torso. So that is another thing. If you catch the jab, right, it's immediate retribution. So he throws a jab, you catch. You guys remember working on the catch? This guy? You've worked on it at least 5 times in the last year. So the catch is when somebody's jabbing you and you go like this. I have a video of you catching a jab, actually. I used you as a video example. That's awesome. All right, anyway. So, a catch here, right? You light a match on your chin. And you're gonna see people do this. That's stupid, don't do that. Just do this. This is the only force you need to stop somebody's jab. And then what you do, bang. That's it. Catch, put their hand right here, and then you throw the 2. Sometimes you throw across, kind of depends on how close they are. If they walk in really far with their jab, like some people take big steps on their jab, if they overstep on the jab here, bang, cross. I typically am gonna throw a straight right over the top, but if they come too close, you can throw a cutoff punch. You throw the straight as a cutoff punch, which means you're gonna throw it at the body. And typically when you're cutting somebody off, you're cutting off like if you're an orthodox fighter, they're an orthodox fighter, and you're stopping their movement to their left, your right. So my opponent that would be here would be moving in this direction. You throw the cutoff, like that, right here, aim at the top of the hip to stop that movement. Not a good last punch to throw, right? You're gonna wanna follow that up with something, but it is an effective cutoff. You can also throw a body hook. Typically, if somebody's trying to escape out of the ring, you're gonna throw a body hook. That's for an entirely different class. But for this one, you can use that as a cutoff punch, especially if somebody's trapped in the corner and they're trying to run out to their left. You throw a hook on this side and then you throw the cutoff, because then you can dive right in and throw like the Mike Tyson long range lead hook. Again, that's another class. Last one, generic counter. Regardless of what the other guy throws, if you have a good straight, you can hit them in a place that matters with a punch that matters. If you just counter with a jab, whatever you're absorbing to throw a jab, mismatch. But if you can throw a straight, That's a punch that, especially if you throw it well and you work on consistency, if it's rapid, precise, and consistent, like all your punches should be, and you can execute it without having to think about it, then it becomes a very, very, very effective counter. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
All right, excellent. Get on the bag, do a freestyle or shadow box if you want, but just work on throwing those different types of two. Good work.